It has been a very difficult week once again in Ukraine. At least 55 people were killed in a Russian rocket attack on the city of Poltava. A military communications centre was targeted in a city that is far from the front lines of the country's war with Russia. One of the single deadliest attacks of the year so far saw at least 300 people injured, and Ukraine's defence chiefs are facing questions about why so many people were present in a military complex that was known to the Russians and had, since the war began, been an obvious possible target. Also this week, President Volodymyr Zelensky engaged in a major government reshuffle, saying he was looking for new energy in his administration. But the country's opposition, there is one, accused Zelensky of trying to centralise power around himself. All of this takes place as Britain is sending 650 air defence missiles to Kyiv, a package worth £162 million and £300 million worth of artillery ammunition procured by the International Fund for Ukraine will be heading in Kyiv's direction from the UK by the end of the year. I am joined now on the line from the Ukrainian port city of Kherson by David Patrikarakos, who is a special correspondent for the Daily Mail. David, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. All of these munitions that the UK, the US and other countries are sending to Kyiv, Kyiv's hands are still somewhat tied behind their backs, are they not, in terms of exactly how they can use them?
That's absolutely right, Simon, they are. And this is a huge problem. A couple of months ago, I was in Kharkiv. And the Kharkiv is very close to the Russian border. And what the Russians were doing, were using glide bombs, these type of bomb that can be fired from an aeroplane. And the Russians were firing them from inside Russian territory at Kharkiv, causing huge damage. I saw the damage personally, especially almost exclusively on civilian buildings. And the Ukrainians were unable to respond in kind. So we had a situation where the Russians were pounding them with impunity and the Ukrainians were literally not allowed to respond. Now, eventually, the Americans saw the error of their ways and they did allow them in Kharkiv to fight back. And as a result, the Russians were pushed back and the attacks on Kharkiv they lessened and fewer people died. So it is a clear case of Ukraine's hands being tied behind its back.
If Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and all the rest said to Volodymyr Zelensky, OK, no restrictions now, do whatever you want with that weaponry, what would Ukraine's military capability be in terms of reaching into Russian territory?
Well, that's a good question, and I have an easy answer for you. It would be fairly significant. Look, a couple of months ago, I think I was the first journalist ever to embed with the Ukrainian Special Forces unit as they conducted a long-range deep strike hundreds of kilometers into Russia. Now, they did this with their own weaponry. It was a small plane repurposed as a drone, and they struck an arms manufacturing power plant to take out the power for the arms factory because they don't have enough weapons to take out the arms factory itself. So it's about interrupting the process. And things like this make a difference. They make a difference for two reasons. First of all, it's psychological. If you're a Russian soldier sitting 300 kilometers from the front line, fairly safe and warm, and suddenly a drone comes out of the sky and destroys the building that you're guarding, it's a huge psychological effect on you. It means that your feeling of safety is far less. The second, and it's practical, is that when Ukraine takes out Russian facilities, given sanctions and other things, the only things the Russian can replace it with is cheap Chinese tech or put in temporary fixes. Now, will it mean that Ukraine will win the war? Absolutely not. But it does have an effect, and it is a way of bringing the war to Russia, as we've seen with the Kursk offensive, and it has a huge effect, and we need to do this. Look, Simon, it's very clear. Either we support Ukraine fully, or we tell it to surrender. But this, doing 80% of what they need 3 or 4 months after they most need it, is insanity, especially since we've invested so much anyway.
But David, the flip side of that coin, as you obviously know, is the fear of escalation, that it would inexorably drag NATO into a direct military confrontation with Vladimir Putin, a man who is rattling his nuclear saber on a continuing basis. That's why the Western governments are still so hesitant to do this, right?
Fine, but if you're worried about Russian escalation, don't arm Ukraine in the first place. What's this idea of arming them 3/4? And when it comes to escalation and nuclear saber rattling, let's not forget that Ukraine has recently become the first power to invade Russia since the 1940s. And Putin, far from rattling his nuclear saber about Kursk, is actually ignoring it, pretending it's not happening to his own people. If you strike Russia, you hurt Russia. This is a country that has invaded its neighbor, and it needs to understand the costs of its actions. And appeasement doesn't work. Striking Russia back works. This idea of escalation, I understand it in theory, but practically it's illogical. We're doing it anyway. There are Western equipment, there are Western weapons being used against Russians every day on Ukrainian territory. To say that we can't do something else for fear of annoying or annoying and raging or, escalating the conflict. I think what has been shown over the past few months is that when Ukraine does step up, when it does hurt Russia more directly, the Russians will back down and the Ukrainian cause will be advanced. That much is clear to me.
And David, finally and briefly, just because I'm running out of time, there's one other aspect to this I don't understand. As Vladimir Putin has rattled his nuclear sabre over the last many months, at no point has any Western government that I've seen suggested there should be a serious conversation ultimately about removing Russia's nuclear military capability.
I mean, that's true, but I don't think there's any way of removing Russia's nuclear capability. So I think the thing with nuclear weapons is the states that have them will have them. They're here to stay. It's about making sure that proliferation doesn't spread. And this is the basis, by the way, of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an avowedly asymmetrical treaty which says that several states have the right to nukes, but they can't proliferate. And by the way, that is supported by all the non-nuclear powers. Unfortunately, we can't unring that terrible, terrible bell. We just have to contain it.
David Patrikarakos, a special correspondent with the Daily Mail, currently in the Ukrainian port city of Kherson. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.